Your brain is not generating new thoughts. Right now, as you listen to this, you believe you are thinking freely. You believe you are choosing what to focus on, deciding what matters, interpreting your experience according to your own intelligence. But that is an illusion. What you call thinking is actually a repetition loop. A closed system running the same handful of patterns over and over again, day after day, year after year, until those patterns become the structure of your identity itself. And those patterns are not neutral. They are not helping you. They are slowly dismantling your ability to see clearly, to act decisively, and to exist outside the narrow corridor of conditioned response. Let me be direct about what is happening inside your skull. The human brain does not operate like we imagine it does. We think of ourselves as spontaneous, creative, adaptive. We imagine our consciousness as a kind of open field where ideas emerge, decisions are made, and experience unfolds in real time. But neurologically, this is false. The brain is a pattern recognition machine. It is designed to conserve energy. It is designed to automate, and what it automates most aggressively is thought itself. Research in cognitive neuroscience has demonstrated that the average person has between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day. But here is the critical part. Approximately 95% of those thoughts are identical to the thoughts you had yesterday, and of that 95%, about 80% are negative, self-referential, or fear-based. This means that the vast majority of your mental activity is not conscious deliberation. It is repetition. It is rehearsal. It is the same internal narrative playing on loop, generating the same emotional states, the same behavioral outputs, the same version of reality. You wake up, and within seconds, the loop begins. You think about what you need to do. You think about what you did not accomplish yesterday. You think about how you feel about yourself, about your body, about your status, about your future. You think about other people and what they think about you. You think about money. You think about time. You think about whether you are enough. These thoughts do not arrive because you chose them. They arrive because they are installed. They are grooves in the structure of your cognition, carved deeper every time you repeat them, until the groove becomes a canyon and you cannot see out of it anymore. Now let us get specific. While the exact content of these repetitive thoughts varies from person to person, the underlying structures are remarkably consistent across populations. There are approximately 12 core thought loops that dominate human mental activity. These are not poetic metaphors. These are observable, recurring cognitive structures that shape how you interpret reality. The first is the thought of inadequacy. This is the recurring internal statement that you are not sufficient, not complete, not worthy as you currently are. It appears as self-criticism, as comparison to others, as the feeling that you must become something other than what you are in order to be acceptable. This thought runs underneath almost everything you do, influencing your choices, your relationships, your work, your rest. The second is the thought of time scarcity. This is the persistent sense that there is not enough time, that you are running out, that you are behind. It does not matter how much you accomplish. This thought will regenerate. It is not about actual time. It is about the psychological relationship to temporality, and it keeps you in a state of low-grade panic. The third is the thought of external judgment. This is the loop where you imagine what other people think of you, and you modify your behavior based on that imagined judgment. You are not responding to reality. You are responding to a simulation of other people's opinions, and that simulation controls a significant portion of your behavior. The fourth is the thought of threat. Your brain is constantly scanning for danger, for problems, for things that could go wrong. This is an evolutionary holdover, but in the modern context, it misfires continuously. You are not being chased by predators, but your brain treats social rejection, financial insecurity, and status loss as survival threats. The result is chronic activation of threat detection systems that were meant to be used sparingly. The fifth is the thought of lack. This is the feeling that something is missing, that you do not have enough, that fulfillment exists somewhere else, in some other condition, some other achievement, some other relationship. This thought guarantees perpetual dissatisfaction because it is not based on external circumstances. It is a cognitive structure that reasserts itself regardless of what you acquire or achieve. The sixth is the thought of identity maintenance. This is the ongoing internal project of defending who you think you are. You have a story about yourself, and a significant portion of your mental energy goes toward protecting that story, reinforcing it, making sure it stays coherent. This thought prevents growth because growth requires the dissolution of old identities, and your brain resists that dissolution with tremendous force. The seventh is the thought of comparison. You are constantly measuring yourself against others, not occasionally, constantly. This happens below the threshold of conscious awareness most of the time, but it shapes how you feel about your own life. Comparison is not analysis, it is a reflex, and it distorts your perception of both yourself and others. The eighth is the thought of control. You believe you need to control outcomes, control other people's perceptions, control your own emotional states, control the future. This thought generates enormous suffering because control is mostly an illusion. You are trying to manage variables that are not actually within your capacity to manage, and the failure to do so feeds back into the inadequacy loop. The ninth is the thought of meaning-seeking through narrative. Your brain is constantly trying to turn your life into a story that makes sense. It needs coherence. It needs causality. So it generates explanations for why things happen, why you feel the way you feel, why other people do what they do. But most of these explanations are fabrications. They are post hoc rationalizations designed to create the feeling of understanding, not actual understanding. The 10th is the thought of postponement. This is the idea that real living happens later, that you will be happy when certain conditions are met, that you will start the thing you want to start after you finish the thing you are doing now. This thought keeps you in a perpetual state of deferral, and it ensures that you never fully inhabit the present. The 11th is the thought of self-reference. Every experience gets filtered through the question of what it means about you. You cannot observe something neutrally. You cannot experience something without immediately converting it to a statement about your identity, your value, your status. This constant self-reference collapses the vastness of experience into a narrow, ego-reinforcing loop. The 12th is the thought of separation. This is the foundational cognitive error that underlies all the others. It is the feeling that you are separate from the world, isolated inside your own mind, fundamentally alone, cut off from the larger processes of existence. This thought is so embedded in ordinary consciousness that it is invisible. But it is the root of existential anxiety, and it is reinforced every single day by the structure of your thinking. Now, why does this matter? Why is this repetition destructive? Because these thought loops are not passive, they are generative. They create the world you live in. Your perception is not a camera recording objective reality. Your perception is a construction built from these recurring thought patterns, what you see, what you feel, what you believe is possible. All of it is shaped by the cognitive structures running in the background. When you repeat the same thoughts, you reinforce the same neural pathways. This is basic neural plasticity. The brain strengthens the connections that are used most frequently. So if you spend years thinking the same inadequacy-based, fear-driven, comparison-obsessed thoughts, you are literally sculpting your brain to make those thoughts easier to think and harder to escape. You are building a prison out of electrical signals and chemical gradients, and this has consequences beyond your subjective experience. It affects your behavior. If you think the same thoughts, you make the same decisions, you repeat the same patterns, you enter the same relationships, you pursue the same goals, you avoid the same risks. Your entire life becomes a fractal repetition of the same fundamental structures. You believe you are living, but you are actually rehearsing. You are running a script written years ago, and you have forgotten that it is a script. This is what people mean when they talk about being stuck. They are not stuck in external circumstances. They are stuck in a thought loop. And because the thought loop feels like reality itself, they cannot see a way out. They try to change their lives by changing external variables, new job, new relationship, new city, new diet, but the thoughts remain the same, so the experience remains the same. The scenery changes, but the script does not. The destruction is slow because it is incremental. You do not notice it day to day, but over years, over decades, these thought patterns compress your possibilities, they narrow your perception. They calcify your identity. You become rigid. You become predictable. You lose access to the spontaneous, creative, adaptive intelligence that is your birthright as a conscious being. And in the place of that intelligence, you get a simulation, a repetition, a ghost of thinking. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. If 95% of your thoughts are repetitions, and those thoughts generate your emotions, your decisions, your behavior, then what exactly are you controlling? Where is the freedom you believe you have? Most people operate under the assumption that they are the author of their thoughts, that thoughts arise because they chose to think them. But this is not how it works. Thoughts appear. You do not generate them. You notice them. And then, in a secondary process, you claim ownership of them. You say, this is my thought, I am thinking this. But that is a post hoc narrative. The thought was already there before you claimed it. Neuroscientific research, particularly the work done on the readiness potential by researchers like Benjamin Libet, suggests that unconscious neuroactivity precedes conscious awareness of decision-making by several hundred milliseconds. Your brain has already initiated the process before you experience the conscious intention to act. This does not mean free will is entirely absent, but it does mean that the majority of your mental activity is not under conscious control. You are not steering the ship as much as you think you are. You are a passenger observing the voyage and assuming you are the captain. And the actual captain, the unconscious pattern-generating system, is running on autopilot, following the same routes it always follows. This is why people find it so difficult to change. They set intentions, they make resolutions, they commit to new behaviors. And then within days or weeks they revert. Not because they lack willpower, but because willpower is a conscious process trying to override an unconscious system. And the unconscious system is far more powerful. It has momentum. It has infrastructure. It has been reinforced by years of repetition. Conscious intention is a small voice trying to redirect a massive automated machine. The illusion of control is comforting. It makes you feel like you are in charge of your life, but it is also limiting. Because as long as you believe you are consciously choosing your thoughts, you will not investigate the structures that generate those thoughts. You will not question the loops. You will not examine the patterns. You will simply continue repeating them, believing that each repetition is a fresh choice. So what is the alternative? If you cannot control your thoughts, if they arise automatically from unconscious conditioning, then what can you do? The answer is awareness, not control. Not suppression, not replacement. Awareness. Awareness is the capacity to observe thought without being absorbed by it. This is not a mystical idea. It is the cognitive function. It is the ability to notice that thinking is happening without immediately identifying with the content of that thinking. Most people cannot do this. They are so fused with their thoughts that they cannot see them as objects. Thought and thinker are the same thing, but they are not the same thing. When you develop awareness, you begin to see thoughts as events. They arise, they persist for a moment, and they dissolve. They do not require your engagement. They do not need to be believed, analyzed, or acted upon. They are simply phenomena passing through the field of consciousness. And when you can see them this way, you gain a degree of freedom that was previously unavailable. This is the beginning of change. Not changing the thoughts themselves, that is still control, but changing your relationship to the thoughts. When you are no longer compelled to believe every thought that appears, the thoughts lose their power. The inadequacy thought can arise, and you can notice it without collapsing into adequacy. The fear thought can arise, and you can notice it without being governed by fear. The separation thought can arise, and you can notice it without experiencing existential isolation. This requires practice. The default mode of consciousness is identification. You are trained from childhood to fuse with thought, to take it seriously, to believe it represents reality. Undoing that training is not a quick process. It requires sustained attention, repeated observation, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. Because when you stop identifying with your thoughts, you also stop identifying with the self-concept those thoughts maintain. And that can feel like dissolution. It can feel like losing yourself, but what you are actually losing is the illusion. The repetitive, automated, conditioned self is not who you are. It is a construct, a pattern, a habit. Underneath it is something more fundamental, consciousness itself, the awareness that is present before thought, during thought, and after thought. That awareness is not constructed. It is not conditioned. It is not a loop. It is the space in which the loop occurs. Now, it is important to understand why the brain operates this way. This is not a design flaw. This is evolutionary optimization. The brain evolved to solve problems of survival, not problems of meaning. It evolved to recognize patterns, predict threats, conserve energy, and maximize reproductive success. Repetition is efficient. Automation is efficient. Thinking the same thoughts every day means the brain does not have to waste resources generating new responses to familiar situations. In the ancestral environment, this was adaptive. If you encountered a predator once and survived, it was useful to have that fear response automated. You did not want to have to think through the situation every time. You wanted immediate, reflexive action. The same applies to social dynamics, resource acquisition, threat assessment. The brain built loops because loops work, but the environment has changed faster than the brain can evolve. You are no longer navigating a world where most threats are immediate and physical. You are navigating a world of abstract symbols, delayed consequences, complex social systems, and existential questions. And the brain is still using the same strategies it used 50,000 years ago. It is still automating. It is still looping. It is still trying to predict and control based on past patterns. This creates a mismatch. The strategies that kept your ancestors alive are now the strategies that keep you trapped. The fear response that saved you from predators now activates in response to emails. The social comparison that helped you navigate tribal hierarchies now destroys your self-worth on social media. The urgency that made you act quickly in the face of danger now makes you anxious about abstract future scenarios that may never happen. You are running ancient software on modern hardware, and the result is chronic psychological suffering, not because you are broken, but because the systems designed to protect you are misfiring in an environment they were not built for. And those systems reinforce themselves. Every time you repeat the inadequacy thought, you make it more likely that you will think it again. Every time you activate the threat response unnecessarily, you lower the threshold for future activation. You are training your brain to be more fearful, more anxious, more self-critical, more reactive. So how do you break the loop? Not by force, not by willpower, not by trying to think different thoughts. You break the loop by disrupting the automaticity, by introducing gaps, by creating space between stimulus and response, between thought and identification, between impulse and action. This is done through practice. Meditation is one method, but it is not the only one. Any activity that requires sustained attention to the present moment disrupts the loop. When you are fully engaged in a task, when you are paying close attention to sensory experience, when you are observing your internal processes without judgment, you are stepping out of the automation. You are creating a gap. In that gap, something new can emerge. Not a new thought to replace the old thought, but a new mode of being, a way of existing that is not based on repetition. This is not about becoming a different person. It is about accessing the dimension of yourself that was always there but obscured by the noise of repetitive thinking. The practice is simple but not easy. You sit. You observe, you notice when thought arises. You notice when you get pulled into the thought. You notice when you realize you were lost in thought, and you return attention to the present. Over and over, this is not about achieving a thought-free state. That is another trap. It is about changing the relationship. Thought becomes something you observe, not something you are. Over time, this practice rewires the brain. Neuroplasticity works in both directions. If you can strengthen a pattern through repetition, you can weaken it through disuse. When you stop feeding the loops with attention and belief, they begin to attenuation. They do not disappear entirely, but they lose their grip. They become background noise instead of foreground reality. And in the space that opens up, you begin to notice things you could not see before. You notice that reality is vastly more complex and interesting than the story your thoughts were telling. You notice that your identity is not fixed. You notice that the present moment contains possibilities that the repetitive mind cannot access. You begin to live in a different register of experience. But this leads to a deeper question. If most of your thoughts are repetitions, if most of your behavior is automated, if your sense of self is a construct maintained by cognitive loops, then who are you? What is the you that exists outside the pattern? This is a question that every genuine spiritual tradition has asked, not as theology, as investigation. What remains when the repetitive mind is silent? What is aware of the thoughts but is not the thoughts themselves? This is not a question that can be answered intellectually. It can only be answered through direct observation. When you sit in awareness long enough, when you watch the thoughts come and go without identifying with them, you begin to notice the witnessing presence, the awareness itself. It is not a thing. It is not an object. It is the condition that allows all objects to appear. It is the background against which experience unfolds. This awareness is not personal. It does not have your name. It does not have your history. It does not have your preferences or fears or goals. It is simply present, and it is the same in you as it is in every other conscious being. This is what the separation thought obscures. The feeling of being isolated inside your own mind is a cognitive error. Consciousness is not private. It is the shared ground of all experience. Recognizing this does not solve your practical problems. It does not pay your bills or fix your relationships, but it changes the context in which those problems exist. Because if you are not fundamentally separate, if you are not reducible to the repetitive patterns of thought, then the existential anxiety that underlies all the other loops begins to dissolve. And when that dissolves, the other patterns lose their foundation. So here's what you need to understand. You cannot stop your brain from generating repetitive thoughts. That is how the brain works. But you do not have to be governed by those thoughts. You do not have to believe them. You do not have to let them define your reality. Every moment is an opportunity to notice what is happening, to observe the inadequacy thought without collapsing into inadequacy, to notice the fear without being controlled by fear, to see the separation without experiencing isolation. This is the only freedom available, not freedom from thought, but freedom in relation to thought. And this freedom is not a distant goal. It is not something you achieve after years of practice. It is available right now, in this moment. You can notice that you are aware, You can notice that thoughts are appearing in that awareness. You can notice that you are not compelled to follow them. This is the shift, not a change in content, a change in structure, a change in the fundamental relationship between awareness and thought. And once that shift occurs, even briefly, you know it is possible. You know the loops are not absolute. You know there is another way to exist. The question is whether you will practice that shift, whether you will create the gaps, whether you will observe the patterns instead of running them unconsciously, because the alternative is clear. The alternative is to continue repeating, to continue believing the same 12 thoughts, to continue living the same compressed version of reality, to continue being destroyed slowly, incrementally, by the automation of your own mind. Your brain is not your enemy. It is doing what it was designed to do, but you are not obligated to be the passive recipient of its output. You have the capacity to observe, to question, to create space, to live from a place that is deeper than repetition. This is not motivational rhetoric. This is the simple truth of consciousness. You are awareness, observing thought, not thought itself. And when you recognize that, the thoughts lose their absolute power. They become weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness, sometimes intense, sometimes quiet, but always temporary. The 12 thoughts will continue to appear, but they do not have to define you. They do not have to control you. They do not have to destroy you. You can see them for what they are: patterns, loops, habits, and in seeing them clearly, you step outside their jurisdiction. That is the work, not to become someone new, but to recognize what was always true, that you are the space in which thought occurs, not the thought itself. And in that space, there is freedom, not freedom from difficulty, but freedom in the face of difficulty, the freedom in the face of difficulty, the freedom to respond rather than react, to choose rather than repeat, to live rather than rehearse. This is what is possible. This is what has always been possible. The question is whether you will investigate it for yourself.